Oh, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our evening Dhamma session. Tonight we are doing questions and answers. We got some challenging questions tonight. It's always a surprise, and the challenge never ends. It's a good challenge. It's good to see there are still new things to talk about and to clarify. It seems like in some instances I've maybe been unclear or even misspoke. So I'll try to clarify that tonight. Okay. How do I know? Oh, first of all, I wanted to say I missed Monday, and I'm probably going to be missing Mondays for a while. I've got a meeting now on Monday evening. So I think the Dhammapada on Mondays is going to be put on hold for a while, maybe until January, in fact, because of my schedule coming up. But we'll see. So be forewarned. How do I know when to let go or observe? Or should I observe and let it cease by itself rather than let go? This has been confusing me. Right, so this is something I have talked about before, I think, quite often. Letting go isn't the practice. Letting go is the result of the practice. So you should never be letting go. You should never be actively trying to let go, I guess is the point. You should be letting go, but letting go doesn't come from trying to let go, right? So you should never be trying to let go. You should always be trying to see things clearly. And letting go comes from seeing things clearly. It's not possible to cling to something. This is the claim in Buddhism. It's not possible to cling to something if you see it as it is, clearly. The reason that we cling is because we don't see things clearly. We misunderstand things. We preconceive. Rather than going by the nature of the object, we go by what we think it is, or what we presume it is, what we believe it is, which is warped by our desires, our aversions, our conditioning from so many sources. Right? So all you should ever be trying to do is see things clearly, and so the technique that we teach is to facilitate this ability to see things clearly as they are. Letting go just comes as a result. It's not even letting go, that's misleading, in fact. You never attach in the first place. It's about non-attachment, not giving rise to the thing the state that you would be trying to stop by letting go, right? It's not like you're clinging and then you stop clinging. You never cling in the first place, because the next time you experience that object, you see it clearly as it is. And so the clinging doesn't arise. The reaction, the diversification, papancha, doesn't arise. In the Anapanasati Sutta, okay, so I don't teach based precisely on the Anapanasati Sutta, but it is an interesting question. So the Buddha says, I'm breathing, one should discern I'm breathing short. But due to anatta, isn't this wrong? Because there's no actor. So the problem here this person has is with the word I'm breathing short. That's not a problem. So this whole thing about anatta is, these questions that we have about anatta sort of has the problem that we're confusing the conceptual with the ultimate. So in ultimate reality, there is no self. But in conceptual reality, there certainly is. I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but there is a self in the sense, the specific sense that it's you that's breathing. It's not me that's breathing, or that guy over there that's breathing, right? So when you say I'm breathing, it's not wrong. It's a concept. It's in your mind something that helps you, in fact, to determine the locus, the object. So you're not thinking about that person over there breathing. You're thinking about you breathing. Right, but in an ultimate sense, through observing in that way, one comes to see that there is no self, that reality is just experiences and so on, which doesn't ever get in the way with the fact that you know that it is you that's breathing. You, in the sense, being the first person, right? So the locus is your own experience, not watching that person is breathing in, that person is breathing out, right? Which wouldn't work. But I'm breathing in short, I'm breathing in long. Well, those are very much applicable in that one specifically is very much applicable in the practice that we do, because as you say, rising, falling, there will come an awareness. Now I'm breathing in long, now I'm breathing in short, but the emphasis won't be on the I'm, it'll be on the breath. This breath is long, this breath is short. This is addressed. Mahasi Sayadaw talks about this. Like the Buddha tells meditators to say gacchami, which means I am walking. So in Pali it's easier because you don't have to say ahang gacchami. Ahang meaning I. So ahang gacchami means I am walking. Or ahang nisinomi. Or nisinomi is I am seated. Sayanomhi, amhi is I am. But again, you don't have to say ahang nisinomhi, which would be literally the if you wanted to spell it out. You can omit the ahang in Pali, so you don't have to actually say I am walking. It's implicit in the verb, gacchami or amhi, nisinomhi. But still, it is first person, and so it's not wrong. You have to be able to separate the conceptual. The Buddha used the word I. He talked about this, and he was very clear. He was, this is a concept. I use these words. He even said explicitly, I use these words, but I know the meaning of them. I know the extent of them. That in reality there is no I. It's just called Vihara, convention. Oops, I'm supposed to do that and that. And here's Sanka trying to challenge me, which is good. It's good, but it's good in a way, but it's kind of like, I don't know, it gets me off on a tangent because I feel like these aren't really, the answers to these questions aren't really all that important. But these are important as Buddhists who have questions about how to live our lives. So it's back on this question about acting naturally, and I stand by this idea. Now, acting naturally, of course, is completely wrong in the sense that you should never act according to your own nature just because it's your own nature, because our own nature is often flawed, right? So these philosophies, and it's a common philosophy that one should do what comes naturally, is wrong. So acting naturally, in the sense that I'm trying to explain it, is a different sort of naturally, because if we actually acted in this way, which could be described as being naturally, it would always be pure, right? It means this objective and this sort of goal, this state that we aim for as Buddhists of being having no unnatural states. And unnatural here is specifically meaning we have no internally inconsistent states where we strive for something, but the results are not what we strive for. Meaning we want to be happy. What we do is for the purpose of being happy, for finding peace, and so on, for goodness, for our own benefit. And yet it hurts us. It causes stress and suffering. And I stand by the fact that an arahant does that. Now, the first question here is, if someone's about to eat a live octopus in front of you, would it be Buddhist to grab the dish and prevent him from eating the animal alive? It's a difficult question. I mean, it's not really the right. It's not really possible to say that. It's not Buddhist to do X, but right, it's Buddhist to act naturally, in the sense of having no unnatural states of mind. So it very well might be. I can certainly see an arahant. Don't quote me on this. I guess that's the point, is to quote me, no? Don't consider that what I say is the be-all, end-all right, but it seems to me quite possible, and I might be wrong, that an arahant should just save the octopus, right? Why not? It could be totally natural. On the other hand, another arahant might do nothing. For arahants, they are different, right? They're because acting naturally, that's the other thing, is acting naturally, in the sense that I'm talking about it, is dependent on the individual. It isn't always the same for every individual, which is why arahants act differently. So it isn't prescriptive in the sense that that you're looking for, that it tells you you should do this, you shouldn't do that. It tells you that your mind should be pure no matter what you do. And so there will arise in the mind, much from the brain, really. There's a lot of instigation, it seems, that's organic in the brain. And the mind will be instigated to do X, Y, or Z. And generally it will be fine to do X, Y, or Z as to the extent that the mind isn't reactive, isn't giving rise to defilements. So in some case, one would help the octopus. In some case, one would say that's wrong. In some case, one would do nothing. It's not really at all about the act. It's about one's state of mind. You couldn't look at the person who saved the octopus, look at the person who did nothing, look at the person who said don't do that, look at the person who did whatever, and say that they were wrong based on their activity. You'd have to say they were wrong based on the state of mind when they did said activity. It's going to be very much dependent, right? Because suppose someone sees that, but their brain malfunctions or their mind malfunctions. They don't actually click that person is going to kill the octopus, right? The brain and mind are organic. They're not always going to be. So you can imagine a situation where the person didn't clue in that that's what the person was doing because something malfunctioned in the brain, or more simply, they were distracted, right? They were thinking about something else, or the mind wasn't in that state, and they just observed it. Perhaps even they were just meditating and they were saying, seeing. But in another case, there would arise the perception, this person is killing that octopus is going to die, and so they would grab up the octopus and throw it in the ocean, and I think that would be fine. The problem would come where the person got upset by this person eating the octopus and got angry and rushed to the octopus's aid because they were sad or upset or worried, or that would be unwholesome, which I think is clear to you. So hopefully I've not made that less clear, not made that more confusing. Oh, did I just destroy one? I think I just removed one that I was supposed to answer. Sorry about that. Here we go. Here, an extension to your earlier question. How would you reconcile the idea of not going out of one's way to help others with how the Buddha prevented Angulimala from killing his mother, and how he prevented the war between Sakya and Kolya clans when none of the parties asked the Buddha to intervene? Okay. So there's two different aspects. For the answer to this question is really that the Buddha, what's natural for the Buddha is quite extraordinary, right? And so there's two things here. One aspect of the Buddha's nature is to every morning send his gaze out into the universe. It's called the I think it's like the Brahmajala or something. No, it's not the Brahmajala. It's the Dhammajala or something. I don't know. The net, Buddha Jala maybe is the word. The net of the Buddha, meaning within his gaze. He casts his net out and sees what he catches. So to the whole universe. He goes out through the universe and comes back to Jetavana. So sometimes he sees someone in the monastery, sometimes he sees an angel up in heaven. Whoever he sees that could use his help that day, he goes to help. And so on one day he happened to see Angulimala, who was going to kill his mother. And so as the story goes, that was his daily activity, and it was just the natural course of events for the Buddha. I still stand by the fact that the Buddha didn't go out of his way to help Angulimala. That's part of his daily routine. part of what it means to be a Buddha who has accepted the invitation to help beings before he passes away. The war between the Sakya and the Kolya clans, well, those are his relatives, and so it's another aspect of the Buddha to be concerned with the welfare of his relatives. And he did in another case, when Vidudabba was going to kill the Sakyas, he did the same thing. He went and sat under a tree. He didn't stop. And an interesting thing is with the Sakya and the Kolyas, and with Vidudabba, he never stopped them. He never said, don't. And people get this idea, ham nyat is what they say in Thailand. And someone asked me a very similar question to what you're asking many years ago. And they said, well, what about the Buddha in this ham nyat? Ham means stop. Stop his relatives from killing each other. You know, he actually, ham is like forbid. It's a very strong, fairly strong word. And so I explained that the Buddha never he didn't stop them from killing. He just went and asked them, what's more valuable, blood or water? Because they were fighting over water. And they said, well, blood's more valuable. He said, look, and you're going to spill the blood of each other's, of you know, your royal families over water. So he just gave them something to think about. He taught them, basically. With Vidudabba, it was the same. So Vidudabba was going to kill the Sakyas, and he thought, well, I better go and save my relatives. His relatives had actually acted pretty awful, or fairly awful, not worth being killed over, but no, not worth being killed over. But so that's not even fair to say. Never mind. But they hadn't acted all that nicely. They didn't deserve to be killed, though. So he went and sat under this tree that had no leaves. And Vidudabba, who was actually, you know, appreciated the Buddha, respected the Buddha, came and he saw the Buddha there, and so he got down and he bowed down to the Buddha. And he said, what are you doing here? And the Buddha said, Venerable Sir, why are you sitting under this tree? It's hot out and there's no leaves on this tree. And the Buddha said, oh, well, I have the shade of my relatives to cool me, to keep me cool. Which is a very strong hinted, the implication or implicative of if that's the word, of how he was against this killing of his relatives. It was going as far as he could without actually saying, please don't kill my relatives, because he would never do that, right? It's an interesting line that the Buddha didn't cross. But Vidudabba took the hint, and he said, yes, if I kill the Sakyans, it would hurt the Buddha, so I better not do that. But then he got angry again, thinking about what they'd done. It's a long story what they'd done. They'd basically, they'd given his father, if I'm remembering this correctly, given his father a slave girl as wife, because they didn't want to mix their own lineage. So it was a slave girl who was actually the daughter of a Sakyan, but was an illegitimate daughter or something like that. And anyway, it's a long story. Vidudabba is the offspring of an illegitimate girl. Anyway, it's all worldly things. None of this is really in any way giving a Buddhist lesson. But the second time he goes, and the Buddha goes a second time and sits under this dead tree, and Vidudabba asks again, why are you here? And he says the same thing. Third time, Vidudabba gets angry and is going to go and kill the Sakyans again, and the Buddha doesn't go. He says to himself, I've done what I can. The Sakyans have their karma that they have to, and it's not the karma of what they did in this life, it's past life karma that they have to work out, and I can't help them. So, but that doesn't really answer your question specifically. I mean, it's important to understand the details, that you're not actually claiming that the Buddha rushed to get involved with politics, but it was part of his nature in these two aspects, to help his family and to just every day find someone to teach. That's the tradition that we have. Oops. I just deleted it. That wasn't what I wanted to do. Sorry, I've got to be more careful about how I use this, more mindful, I think. You mentioned that the teaching of anatta in Buddhism does not necessarily go against the belief of an almighty, all-governing God. How would one justify the existence of such an entity with the Buddhist teaching sabbe Dhamma anatta? Wouldn't any possible reality come under the word Dhamma? Also, how does one justify the existence of an all-loving and omnipotent God with the First Noble Truth? Okay, so this is where I think I probably misspoke, or I think I just wasn't clear enough, because I do stand by, to some extent, and I think what I said is it's not clear. There's no clear reason there's no clear proof that a God doesn't exist, simply by the very nature of a God. And I think the problem is that it's intellectual. Intellectually speaking, no matter what reality we say. So you're asking, does it go against the Buddhist teaching, sabbe Dhamma anatta? Well, of course, yes, I think probably it does, but it doesn't really matter, because who says that the Buddhist teaching sabbe Dhamma anatta is right? Or who says that God, this all-powerful God, didn't just create a universe in which that's true, but is still outside of that universe, right? This is how the theists get outside of any epistemic, is that the word, claim of refuting God, because God can always be outside of the system, right? That's the nature of being, in a sense, omnipotent, but it isn't even omnipotent, but supremely powerful, because you have the final say over everything, right? It's like being the President of the United States. You can talk about law all you want, but there's someone who's, or the chairman of the People's Republic of China. You've got the system, but then you've got someone who is theoretically outside of the system. Now, I think you're onto something here, and I hope I didn't try to say that we have no response to this, but I think I just was lazy in terms of not going the next step. I have done a video many years ago on God where I actually tried to address this question and tried to actually provide evidence and proof. And I think the answer is sort of what you're getting at here. The whole thing about the First Noble Truth is a whole other argument. It's another way of approaching it. But I think a better one is the sabbe Dhamma anatta. It's good. But what it says, what it claims, is that God, no matter this God being outside of the system or not, God is not the sort of thing that could possibly exist. And I think you'd have to sort of appeal to the whole nature of the word existence or exist. And it is problematic because it does depend what you mean by existence. But I think this is where I fall back on Descartes. I mean, I don't really have to, but from a Western perspective, it helps to bring up people like Descartes, where he says, it doesn't matter what sort of God there is, in the end, experience is experience, right? Experience is real. Experience is undeniable. You can't be tricked into thinking that you're thinking, into thinking that you're experiencing, or perceiving that you're perceiving. Right? You are perceiving in order to do anything, in order to even talk about existence, which is why Buddhism puts the basis of reality on sense perception. The basis of reality is experience. It's really absurd from a Buddhist perspective, and I'm studying, many of you know, I'm studying ancient philosophy right now, and it's really the main problem with all of it, or much of it, is that they're very much into trying to prove the existence of stuff outside of sense experience. And it's really interesting that same as we do now, in ancient times they went far, far beyond what you can possibly claim to exist. What exists can never be more than experience. And so when you talk about a God, or when you talk about a chair, when you talk about anything, a teapot, it doesn't matter if there is a teapot orbiting around the sun up there somewhere in space. It doesn't actually exist. What exists is very simple. But that's only one way of describing things. We can't we can't provide proof to someone who doesn't see the world the way we see it. We can't provide proof that this is true, because all you have to do is change the paradigm and say, in terms of a space-time or whatever, all those things actually exist. That teapot does exist in some sense. Now, I suppose, and I think it's fair to say that we would argue that the sense perception paradigm, the experiential paradigm, is superior, because in order to talk about those things, you require experience. But the impersonalist, I don't know what the right word is, but the person who sees things as existing outside of experience, can never be really convinced of that, or can never really be refuted, because they're just looking at the world. They're making claims that are outside of our purvey, outside of the way we look at things. So what I'm trying to say, and I think what's important in what I'm saying, is that we're not really trying to talk about what exists. We're not really scientists in the sense that we're seeking ultimate knowledge of everything. We are realists, or we're pragmatists in terms of saying, we look at the world in terms of what is provable, and all that's provable is that which is based on experience. You can talk all you want about God, or the teapot, or even the chair in the room, but you can never prove it. And so pick up that paradigm and talk about it and go nuts. And this is what so much of philosophy does, so much of science does. And as a Buddhist, I don't think we have to say none of that exists, but maybe we could, but it's just a way of looking at the world. But what's more important is that we show how much better, how much more useful this way of looking at the world is, right? Rather than talk about, is there a God, isn't there a God? And I think that's easier and more useful, because it doesn't matter whether a God exists. It doesn't matter whether anything exists. It doesn't matter whether there's a teapot orbiting the sun. And in the same way as that teapot isn't consequential, it isn't consequential whether there's a God. Reality is reality, and experience is experience. And the way out of suffering is the way out of suffering. It's God. But I think there's implications there that, given that that's the case, God isn't something that could exist. And I think there is an answer. Right? So I think if I gave the implication that I think we have to admit the potential for a God to exist, that wasn't exactly what I tried to say, or what I should have been trying to say. I think the point was that it's not immediately obvious, unless you take the step of seeing, of investigating ultimate reality and seeing this sabbe Dhamma anatta. When you start to see that all Dhammas are non-self, it becomes ridiculous to think that there could be something like a God, or even anything, even something like a chair, a bed. We had this big argument in philosophy. I've just stopped. I'm sitting back and just listening now, because I don't want to. I think it's just not resonating. They don't get what I'm saying. I don't get what they're saying. So I've stopped asking questions in class. But we had an argument about whether a bed has something in it that's intrinsically bed, that the bed is intrinsic to the thing, and it's just a thicket of views. As for justifying the existence of an all-loving, omnipotent God, well, I mean, an omnipotent God doesn't mean they're all loving. God could be, and seems to be, if there were a God, it seems that God is a very cruel and evil sort of being. There's no sense in my mind that God could ever be a loving being, if such a being could possibly exist. But I think we have to admit the potential for beings to influence other beings, right? So to that extent, the idea of a being who could influence beings more powerfully than other beings is completely possible. And so the existence of a being who could ultimately influence beings anytime, to any distance, right? Like what we think of as a God, but the problem is there's a limit, because no being can actually go beyond the providing of stimuli or the providing of instigation. A being cannot make another being angry, for example. A being cannot make another being greedy. A being can only provide stimuli: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, thinking. So that's a really important point, I think, in the argument, in the conversation about the existence of an omnipotent God, or the concept of omnipotence. Because no being ever has the power to change the quality of one's mind. There's no evidence of that, and there's clear evidence against that. So omnipotence would be limited and would be meaningless in the end, right? Suppose there were a God who could, like Job, let's say. Suppose I were Job and God came and killed my kids and gave me all sorts of diseases and sufferings. Couldn't really make me suffer, right? Because it's dependent on my mind. If my mind were pure, then God's power would be. It's like Mara. Mara is really the closest that we have in Buddhism. Mara tried so hard to disturb the Buddha. Couldn't do it. So I'm sorry, I think that's a lot to talk about. And again, I would like to focus on meditative questions, but these are questions of ultimate concern, so no problem there. Do you recommend contemplations about death or visualization of corpses, dead bodies, as a ancillary practice, not as a main practice? But if you want to do it from time to time, it's wholesome. It can be wholesome, provided it's done properly, and you don't let it overwhelm you. It can be a good way to cultivate both loathsomeness and urgency, a sense of urgency. Loathsomeness means destroy the attachment to the body. When you observe a dead body, you see, oh, the body's not really something worth attaching to, because it's kind of icky. Or not icky, in an ultimate sense, it's neither nor. It's just something that there's no reason to cling to it either way. Oops, I did it again, right? Is it possible to observe mindfulness the same as other Dhamma, or is it impossible? Well, we don't ever observe Dhamma, but if you're talking about being mindful of being mindful, mindfulness is something that happens right after the experience. So theoretically it's possible, but I think you have to be careful to not confuse what's happening in an ultimate sense from a point of view of the Abhidhamma to what's happening practically. Practically speaking, are you mindful? Are you meditative? And practically speaking, of course, you would just say to yourself, mindful, or even just knowing. In an ultimate sense, it's a little more complicated. On the ultimate attainment and outcome of our practice, which is becoming an arahant, what do arahants value and why? Buddhism says that kindness is a good thing. So again, it's words. Words make things difficult. There's an imprecision here. Do arahants value kindness? Why would an arahant care to be kind? So again, this is why it's important. These kind of questions, it's a good question. I mean, it's sort of the dilemma that we have trying to explain when we give this theory about, or this doctrine. It sounds like something that's counterintuitive or impossible, or doesn't bear out under the evidence, because arahants still appear to do things, or does that mean an arahant just does nothing, right? And again, so I think it has to be explained as being natural. An arahant acts often very similar to how they acted before, but the difference is the purity, right? It's like you have this food, like a puffer fish. A puffer fish. Apparently there's this fish, a puffer fish, and you can eat it. It's a delicacy. Poor fish though, yes. But in order to eat it, you have to take out a poison gland, and it's deadly poisonous. And if you're not careful, you'll die from eating it. I don't like using the puffer fish example because I feel sorry for the poor puffer fish, but you get the idea. If you have you have chlorine and sodium, right? Both of these are very poisonous. You eat sodium, you'll die. You eat chlorine, you'll die. But sodium chloride is something we put on our food every day, right? I think. That's not even a good example either. But if you have it's like a food or a drink that you take the poison out of. Somehow you remove the harm from it. It's still the same food, it's still the same drink, but you've made it pure. And so the person who's enlightened will act like an ordinary person, but their acts, the natural acts, will be free from poison. So it's not a question of what they value, or etc., etc. In fact, you might argue that they don't value anything, but that's not really accurate, because they appear very much to value things, and quite strongly. But it's really just an appearance. It's because it's who they are. It's because no, it's not even because of who they are. It's because of nature. It's because nature is true nature, and I'm just using the word nature actually in a fairly subjective way, operative definition here. But the nature is inherently wholesome. It's inherently composed, because wholesome has the nature of being composed. There's something wrong with unwholesomeness, and wrong in a very objective sense. It's wrong, it's diffuse, it's perverse, not even in a sense of being judgmental. It's just naturally dependent on defilements, dependent on attachment. Right, well, it is actually an attachment. Hope that was helpful. Okay, I have no sense of smell is a really unique question. I've never had this one, I don't think. So I have almost no sense of smell. I have good health insurance and can probably have this corrected. I am unable to smell spoiled food, fire, or a gas leak on my own for safety reasons. Correction seems logical. I agree. I'm wondering if allowing myself a new sense I have gone so long without would hinder the meditation practice. Would it not be better to go without this sense than to fall into liking, disliking, and clinging to these new sensations? So, no, I don't think that's a valid concern. I think similarly, a valid concern might be the newness of the experiences might lead to excitement. That's certainly possible. I wouldn't put too much weight on even that concern. It seems to me it's about correcting a health problem, which seems valid to me. Practically speaking, the sense of smell is useful, and you're what's the word? You're disabled. Is that the right word? You have a disability when you don't have the sense of smell. So there's reason. Now again, you'd want to sort of weigh the importance of it. I would say that's the first thing, against the cost of it. So if it were prohibitively expensive, you might say, well, it's not worth the cost. But here you have health insurance and it's free or whatever, cheap. I would say to that extent it's worth it. Now the concern about will this give rise to further defilements, I think is, as I said, potentially valid in the sense that the newness of it might specifically give rise to excitement and so on. You'd just be so excited about smells that you've never smelt. But defilements don't come from the senses, and they certainly won't come from having new sensory experiences, not per se. They come from the nature of your mind, the inclination of the mind. So if you're inclined to cling to things, then you're going to cling to whatever, whether it be seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, or thinking. To some extent, I think what we're more concerned with is trying to stay away, practically speaking, from those things which we are already attached to. And so I would suggest that probably you'll have more trouble. You won't find as much trouble from these new experiences as you will from those that are familiar to you. Those like, well, sexual attraction, like food attraction, and so on. So what you'd want to, because desire is habitual, and the strongest desires are going to be those things that we have been desiring for the longest period of time. So putting aside past lives, which may actually happen, you'll like some smell some smell based on past life experiences. I would say a lot of your smell experiences will be just completely pure, and pure isn't a great thing in this sense, because it's like an empty slate and it's just waiting for a new habit to form. So you could cultivate, and probably quite quickly, strong habits of attraction to your sense of smell. But if, on the other hand, when you gain your sense of smell, you're quite mindful, well, then I would argue that you would develop quite quickly positive habits towards your sense of smell. As in the case with any new sensory experience, like when you see something new for the first time, it's quite possible to cultivate states of attraction to it, even though you have sense of sight. The new thing, the newness of it, right? But it's also quite possible to develop wholesome qualities. It's like a blank slate, I guess, is the quickest way to answer your question. So I wouldn't be overly concerned. Again, be careful of the excitement and the newness, but if you're mindful, it shouldn't be a problem. Let me know how it goes, if you do decide. If individuals ideally should only be concerned about their own spiritual development, how could scientific advancements such as cures for diseases and vaccines to prevent disease happen? So I don't think it's fair to say one should only be concerned about one's own spiritual development. One should be concerned, right, because the implication there, it's almost right, but the implication there is that such a person wouldn't help other people. And the point is, one's own spiritual development involves helping other people. So I guess the answer to your question is that one's own spiritual development involves, quite often, not always, but quite often involves, majority of the time, it involves helping others. I would say there probably wouldn't be as much scientific advancement, certainly true, because much of scientific advancement is impure. the vast majority of scientific advancement isn't for the purpose of helping people. It's for money, it's for prestige even. It's just, there's lots of reasons. It's tainted by the cruelty towards animals. It's tainted by manipulative practices and all sorts of things. It's tainted by ego. It's tainted by greed. It's tainted by many things. And so an argument that's not really a direct argument, but an argument against that sort of thing is the claim that we're creating a lot of sickness, certainly a lot of mental sickness, but I would argue as a corollary, we're creating a lot of physical sickness through our science on so many levels, right? Our research into, and it's unrelated to what you're talking about, but our research into hormones and antibiotics has allowed us, or has been totally directed towards allowing us to grow animals for meat in horrific conditions. You just pump them full of antibiotics and you can crowd them in as tight as you want. And give them hormones so that they grow quicker, etc., etc., etc. And so even putting aside the horrific cruelty towards the animals themselves, I mean, our food sources become contaminated and full of chemicals that are unhealthy for us. We have cancer. How much red meat is cause for cancer, right? They're just starting to see this, but how complicated is that statement, right? How much of that is the chemicals? How much of that is the meat itself? How much of it is the processing of the meat? And how much of it is the mental evil that is destroying the body from the get-go, right? It's a complicated state, but it's all related. And so even our search for cures, our search for vaccines, it's all tainted. And it's all, even the purest form of searching for a vaccine or a cure for a sickness, which does exist. I mean, I think there is a strong trend to cure people, to help people, to cure polio and that kind of thing. I think there's really a good wholesomeness involved there. It's treating the symptoms in many cases. And so I think you could argue that even a society that was predominantly Buddhist and inclined towards Buddhist principles would cultivate cures to some extent. I mean, it would be slower because we wouldn't use animals as test subjects. Not in the same way, I don't think. I mean, I think you could argue for testing things on animals. That's iffy, but I mean, I think there's an argument to be made for, I don't know, that's pushing it, isn't it? I'm just thinking, like, if you consider using, like, take humans, if we test on humans, you could argue for that, because we would consent to it. We would say, okay, well, we want to develop this cure, well, let's test it out on ourselves. But then how would that relate to animals? Would it be cruel to test things on animals? I think what I was thinking of is, you'd obviously have to be clear that you didn't have any thought that this was going to kill the animal, right? You were just going to test and see if it actually cured the animal. Now, as far as giving the animal a sickness in the first place, that would, I think, clearly, without doubt, be unwholesome. But suppose you came across an animal that had a sickness, right? So an animal had cancer to start with. I think you could make an argument for testing anti-cancer drugs on that animal, right? I mean, that seems reasonable. Or, it's complicated, but there is some potential there. Now, would arahants do this? Most likely not. Arahants wouldn't be concerned about such things, but you're not talking about arahants, you're talking about individuals, and as Buddhists, there's a lot of room for this sort of thing on our road, on our path to become arahants. It's just a road. It's just about navigating ourselves so that we don't get off the path. If you start to inject sicknesses into animals to see if you can then cure them, or I heard about this one woman who was intent upon finding a cure for paralysis, and so her job, and she eventually it drove her crazy and she had to give it up, was to sever the spinal cord in rats and then try to put it back together again, right? That a Buddhist would never do. That is just to think about, Incredible. Boredom nags, boredom enervates. Boredom makes me seek entertainment and distraction. Boredom is ego's manifold disguises. This is an interestingly worded question. How can I cope with it? Through practice or insight? Yes. Through practice and insight. Having craving or aversion towards something with all your heart intensifies suffering so much. What's the question? If you really hate feeling angry, then you find yourself always experiencing anger. Or if you really want happiness, you seem to never find it. Well, try practicing mindfulness. You should find that it helps. Sorry, I hope that's not overly brief. But I think that's one of those questions that can, if you read my booklet and try to practice according to our technique, it might help it. But here's William, who still can't feel the rising and falling. You're not stressed, but there is a tension and sometimes pain, so note the tension and the pain. That's fine. Then go back and try to find the rising and falling. I'm sure you're going to find it. I can't remember if you can't find it even when you're lying down, but I'd recommend trying to do a lot of lying meditation. But yes, the practice can be just as productive without feeling rising and falling. There's nothing special about it. It's just an object. But I would wager that, if I were a wagering person, I would wager that you're going to find it eventually. And would doing certain exercises help to strengthen? No, it wouldn't. It's not about exercises. Try doing lying meditation, see if you can find it then. If you really just can't find it, then just say sitting, touching, or that kind of thing. I went into a state that I can only describe as losing consciousness, almost like falling into a deep sleep. There was no experience at all in this state. I wasn't sleepy when I regained consciousness. Is this an experience of Nibbana or something else? I can't say. I can't tell you what that experience was. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Again, this is all about the difference between practice and result. Don't worry too much about the results. Be clear about whether you're practicing properly. That's much more important. And that doesn't have to rely upon the results. You don't have to say, practicing. Did I get anything out of it? It's not how you define whether your practice is good. Your practice is good when it's pure, when it creates a pure mind in that moment. And if it creates a pure mind in that moment, then you don't have to worry about what the result is. You don't ever have to think, did I get anything out of it? What have I got out of this? What is the result? You'll never have to think like that. You'll be pleasantly surprised sometimes when good results come. Maybe this sounds like a good result. Perhaps it's an experience of Nibbana. So you'll be pleasantly surprised by those. And then you'll go back to doing what's important, which is being mindful. How can we suggest to others to try out or explore meditation? I often find people who greatly benefit from it but have prejudices or misconceptions about it and are not interested in it. Well, again, this is about acting naturally. You don't go out of your way to try and convert other people. You be mindful and people will convert based on your mindfulness. People will become interested in meditation based on your own results. What is the original meditation technique of the Buddha? Practice like the labeling technique employed in the Mahasi tradition does in this respect seem to reflect quite well with the early... Wow. Analayo said that? That's great to hear. I don't know too much about him. Everyone raves about him. I'll start raving about him too if he says things like this. Good for him. Well said. There you go, people. Those of you who doubt this, look up Venerable Analayo. I don't even think he's part of our tradition, but he's... you might scoff at him because he's very much a scholar, from what I understand. But he's very well respected. So as a scholar, as someone who's done a lot of study, for him to say that, there you go. Original meditation technique of the Buddha? Well, the Buddha's, what he practiced was anapanasati, because he had to gain all sorts of high mental powers to remember past lives and to see beings arising and passing away. But in the third watch of the night, he switched to, he didn't practice anapanasati in the third watch. He practiced some form of insight meditation where he understood paticca samuppada. But I guess you could argue that his first was anapanasati. Do you have any advice on how to work in a detached way? It's related to right livelihood, specifically for lay practitioners. How do you work in a selfless, egoless way? Well, by being mindful. I mean, it's not something that's easy. And you start to see how difficult it is, right? How many lay people said how difficult it is to... The lay life is like a dusty road. The life gone forth is like the open air. What if I were to leave this way? So you see how difficult it is, but the answer is still the same. It's still just about being mindful when you can and cultivating mindfulness as a part of your experience. I often hear people say that you're not a true Buddhist if you eat meat, or that to be a real Buddhist you must have attended to precise ceremony. What can one answer to that? Any advice on how to handle these situations? Well, tell people that being Buddhist, the word being Buddhist, the expression being Buddhist depends very much on who is saying it. It means different things, very, very different things to different people. So there's no such thing as a true Buddhist because there's so many different kinds of Buddhism. The Buddhism that I practice doesn't require you to be a vegetarian, and it doesn't require you to attend a precise ceremony. So there are certain types of Buddhism and certain teachers of Buddhism who require both those things, but that doesn't make them authentic. The most authentic would be following what the Buddha or a Buddha actually taught. That would, I think, be universally accepted as the most authentic. The problem is we don't have a strong agreement on what the Buddha taught or what a Buddha teaches. And so there are diverse views. But I would argue in general, there aren't too many groups groups that claim that the Buddha required vegetarianism or requires vegetarianism. And there aren't that many groups that claim that the Buddha or that Buddhism requires you to undertake a specific ceremony. There are a lot of modern teachers who do of the various Buddhist traditions, but that's different. Okay, that's all the questions. It's okay, no? Thank you all for coming out. Have a good night.